So much, and condolences first of all to you and of course your colleagues.
Thank you, Alicia.
Now, Professor, firstly, how well did you know some of these passengers? It sounds like you really had formed a bond with them.
Yes. Well, there were about more than 100 passengers on the flight who were on their way to this large international AIDS conference that's taking place in Australia. But I had a very strong friendship and history of working together with probably the most famous person on the flight in terms of AIDS research, Professor Joep Lange. He was a Dutch researcher who had been one of the founder researchers developing antiretrovirals in the early days of HIV. And I'd worked with him for probably approaching 20 years.
Now, Professor, what kind of work did they do actually?
Well, he was an extraordinary individual. He was a strong personality who said things as he saw them and didn't mince his words. And that was really important in the early days of HIV because he pushed very hard around the clinical trials to develop new antiretrovirals. And then later on, when he realized that these drugs were not going to be accessible to particularly people living in the African region, he formed another company which was dedicated to getting antiretrovirals out to poor communities.
All right. Now, Professor, we understand that they were on a way to a very serious conference, as you've just mentioned. Please just tell us what this conference is all about.
Yes, well, the AIDS world comes together every 2 years for a very, very large conference under the banner of the International AIDS Society. In fact, Professor Joep Lange, who died in this crash, was a previous president of that society. But there are about 14,000 people who will be gathering in Melbourne. And the idea of this is to bring not only researchers and clinicians together, but it brings everyone together. It brings activists and NGOs. And it really is to redouble our efforts around HIV and eventually getting on top of this epidemic globally.
And your words to the ones that have lost their loved ones and through such a great cause, Professor, what are your words?
You know, I think one of the tragedies here is that 100 people died, and these 100 people came from many different walks of life and many different expertise around HIV. But these were all people who were committed to doing good. They wanted to actually get on top of a terrible disease. And why did they die? Because they were taken out in an explosion, an unnecessary, foolish explosion that will not solve anything for anybody. So my words to all the families is, you know, really one of compassion. But I think for the AIDS world, having lost a significant leader, then we have to continue.
And of course continue with the UN AIDS concert that is also going to be taking place. If you can tell us about that, Professor.
Yes, well, the UN AIDS has come out with a new report, as you know, and with optimism on the one hand about progress we are making around HIV with fewer new infections, but also recognizing the challenges. And those challenges really are still with us in South Africa.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
I know it must have been difficult, and that's of course Professor Helen Reese, Head of Productive Health at the University of Witwatersrand.